Hi friends, Flavio here. One of the questions that I get a lot in the classes is to clarify a little bit more from a deeper perspective, not so much from like a religious perspective, to clarify a little bit more this notion of heaven and earth, or the spiritual world and the physical world. The notion of spiritual and physical world shows up early on in the so-called fall of man. So Adam and Eve live in the Garden of Eden, but then they partake of the forbidden fruit and they're expelled from the garden. And so the Lord God punishes the man, the woman, and the serpent with a different idea, each one of them. So the man will have to live off of the sweat of his brow, the woman will have childbirth pains, and the serpent will have to crawl on the earth. And presumably, if the serpent has to crawl on the earth and they've been expelled from the garden, they are now in the physical world as opposed to the paradise where they lived before, which is the spiritual world. I mean, that's an allegory, that's a story, that's a metaphor, but it is useful for us to understand this notion of duality, two different worlds, spiritual world, the physical world. So let's begin by understanding one thing. The notion of these two worlds has nothing to do with a displacement in space. In other words, it's not like the spirit world is here and the physical world is over there. They're not separated in space. So an example of that I often use in class is that if you turn on a scanner or a radio here in this room, you're going to pick up a number of different stations. And all of these different waves of information are in the air right now, and one wave does not interact with the other. But if I want to receive a different station on my radio, I don't have to move to a different location. I simply have to tune the receiver to a different frequency. So we understand how the same concept can apply to the physical world and spiritual world. They're both right here, but there's a different frequency that allows us to interact with one world or with the other world, and many worlds in between, obviously. So when we talk about switching frequencies on a radio, that's an obvious concept. Everybody has used the radio before, a scanner, a receiver, we know what that means. When we talk about switching frequencies in ourselves to perceive the spiritual world, the question is, what are we really switching? And it has to do with the mind, of course, because it isn't the body that perceives it, and it isn't the soul. The soul is part of the spiritual world. So it has to be the mind that makes the adjustment. So when the mind is focused, or when the mind is operating from the perspective of one state, it perceives certain things that are in correspondence to that state. When the mind is tuned in a different frequency or state, it's going to perceive different things that are typical of that particular world or frequency. So a state or frequency is something that you can easily appreciate the concept of a state. If I told you that John is in a romantic, sometimes we use the word for state, we use the word mood. You would say John is in a romantic mood. Or if you say Mary is in an angry mood or state. So substitute the word mood that we use colloquially for the word state. So being romantic is a state which goes with your words, with your actions, with your behaviors, how you walk, how you talk. Being angry is also a state that goes with certain actions and behaviors and so forth, right? So you understand the concept of a state. Now, let's go back to this notion. The spiritual world and the physical world are only different by a change in state, or a change in a mood, if you will, or a retuning of the mind. So if we tune the mind into the concept of scarcity, the concept of separation, the concept of amnesia, forgetting, which altogether come down to the idea of fear. If we focus on fear, then we are functioning in the physical world. The opposite of all this is what? Abundance, complete knowing, right? The opposite of forgetting is complete knowing all the time, complete abundance, and complete union. You see, look at a person, for instance, how they handle their different relationships, and you can immediately gauge where they're at physically versus spiritually. It's very easy to gauge. Person functions based on fear. Person functions based on separation. The whole notion that we can even separate from one another. From a spiritual perspective, that notion is so silly. And of course, we have to respect the person's awareness at that moment and respect the fact that they believe they can be separated from someone else. But there is no such a thing. We're all part of the same thing. I understand, of course, what people mean here on the earth. Oh, we're going to separate. But the reality is that the greater the urge to separate, the more we've bitten the apple, the more we are in a state of suffering, in a state of fear, in a state of lack of abundance, in a state of shortage, in a state of scarcity. You see, humanly speaking, it is okay if two people don't want to continue walking together along a journey, let's say. Sometimes they have commitments together, it becomes difficult to dissolve. I'm working with a man right now who has a very large business, multi-million-dollar business, with his ex-wife. And they divorced years ago, but they kept running the business together as partners. And it worked for a while. And he was telling me today or yesterday that it's getting really difficult to continue running the business with the ex-wife because, they have, in any business, you would have friction, but the fact that they have a history together makes them both very uncomfortable. So they want to liquidate the business and split the assets and so forth, So the point I'm making is that sometimes there are commitments that make it difficult to split or separate, but people are inherently free. And sometimes we make a promise and a commitment to another person, a friend, a neighbor, whatever the case might be, a spouse, a boyfriend, a girlfriend. And sometimes we change our minds, which is perfectly okay. And it's inevitable in the physical world, right? People change their minds. Of course, if a person constantly changes their minds and they have a history of failed relationships, obviously there's something going on there that they're not addressing. But more importantly, pay attention to how the person breaks off their relationships, and you can immediately tell where they're at. When a person is living in a state of abundance, in a state of unity, in a state of communion, in a state of grace, in a state of understanding, even if they have to break up a relationship, they're still available, they're still present, they still exist. In other words, look, we want to modify how we interact. And I deal with this all the time here at the office. And people come in here and they say, oh, I want this person to disappear. I want this person to drop dead. I want this person to be, the earth to open up and swallow this person, And I explained to them, I said, look, whatever your feelings and beliefs are right now, I can understand. Perhaps you're angry because things didn't go the way you wanted. But I'm telling you that if you hold on to that state of mind, that you're only harming yourself. Because you're living in a state of extreme physicality, which will, if we persist on it, it eventually damages the physical body. It does. It's just a natural law. It's just consequence of natural law. So what we have to learn to do is be a little bit softer on these things, a little bit softer, be a little bit more forgiving. Ask ourselves a couple more questions. Are things really the way I say they are? Or am I telling myself a story, a myth, in order to justify what I want to do? I remember when in 1981 or whatever, the Falklands War broke up between Argentina and England. And I read all about it. I lived in Brazil. I went to school. I was in high school, whatever. And we read all about the conflict, the war, from the Argentinian perspective. And of course, they seemed to be right. And then years later, in 1987, I believe I lived in London, studying theater there, and I started reading about the war from the English perspective. And I realized it was like two different wars, And the point I'm making is that in order to be able to justify a war, we have to first manufacture an enemy. So sometimes a person lives in this state of fear, not because they actually have an enemy. In fact, oftentimes the person they construe as their enemy actually loves them very much. What's more common in what I see here at the office is a situation where a person, for whatever reason, wants a particular change in their lives. But in order to be able to implement that, you see, they have to construe, they have to manufacture an enemy to justify the changes that they want to make. Let me ask you a question. If you are in a committed relationship with somebody, let's say, and you change their mind, you don't want to continue, have you ever met a person who's able to sit down with the other person and say, look, I know I made a commitment to you. See, they first acknowledge the commitment. I know I made a commitment to you. I know I made a number of promises to you. But please understand, I can no longer continue living like this. Notice, if the person is sincere, number one, they acknowledge the commitment. Number two, they inform you of the fact that they've changed their minds. And if they're really sincere, they say, the true problem here is that I cannot accept these conditions, but if they were to change, my commitment stands. And then people negotiate and change, and they overcome conflicts oftentimes. When a person doesn't even want to give you that opportunity, don't worry about it. You're dealing with a person who lives in fear. Because what are they afraid of? Why can't they sit with you and say, I don't want to continue? Or I don't want to continue under these conditions? What are they afraid of? Could it be that if they were simply to tell you what's going on with them, would it be the case that perhaps you would rebuttal and explain how you feel and what happened or didn't happen, and they would end up feeling that what's really happening there is a capricious desire to live a different experience and a resistance to growth, and oftentimes it is actually a shame that they live with. What shame? Is the recognition that the way the relationship started was entirely fake. Because there's no way, Leo Buscaglia says this in his book Love, and I met Leo Buscaglia actually in Minneapolis, and a fascinating author and human being. And Leo Buscaglia says, there's no way to be in love and out of love. If you love, period. And if you love one person, you love all people, because there's love in your heart. So this notion that I love you today, I don't love you tomorrow, this notion is so silly. It's for children. You know, children tell their parents when they don't get the cookie, oh, I hate you. And adults do the same thing. They don't get a cookie from their husbands, whatever the cookie might be, and they hate their husbands. Next day they love them. And husbands do the same thing to wives. Because, as a friend of mine used to say, just because he wears pants, he's not necessarily a man. And just because she, whatever, looks a certain way, she's not necessarily a woman yet. And I don't mean this in a sexual sense, like man, woman, like, you know. I mean that we're not adults oftentimes. Our work over here is awesome, at least that's what people tell me, for two reasons. Look, the work that we do here is awesome because people's lives are transformed. People thank me profusely. Like just today, this couple was telling me, wow, we both love you. And I was so gratified, and I have to admit, there's a little part of us therapists, you know, that there's an appreciation there. When a couple comes over and they're in dire straits, they're living a very difficult situation, they completely transform their lives as a result of your interaction, and then they let you know voluntarily without you asking, wow, you really, really helped us out here, and we love you. They say those words, and something within us heals because there's a loop there that closes, you know, and it's such a beautiful experience, you know, to see that transformation happening. And who are the people that are able to achieve those kinds of transformations? The people who are willing to be sincere with themselves. It's okay to change your mind. It's okay to want to live a different life, but there's a sincerity there. So the need to manufacture an enemy and cut things out is just a justification to not have to deal with what's really happening right there. And at the end of the day, that person is hurting him or herself. I see this all the time over here. A person comes over to see me and they say, oh, you know, my ex is like this, you know, I blocked him, I did this, I did that, I filed paperwork, I did all this crap, you know, and it's my job, I know, but it's more than my job. I sometimes feel a little guilty in the sense that I don't have a job, in the sense that, you know, I work here 10 hours a day, but to me, it's not a job, it's a way of life. I've been doing this since I was a kid. I just didn't know that I was a natural-born healer, you know. I was the kind of guy in school that everybody came to tell their problems, and I was always the one with some insight. I've come to learn over the years that I'm what they call an empath. I don't know how I was born with the ability to know what you're thinking and feeling naturally. In fact, it's such a powerful thing that oftentimes in my personal life, it gets me into trouble. And it gets me into trouble because you and I could be talking right now and you could be telling me, oh, I'm feeling this, or I want this, or I want that. And there's an instant knowing inside of me whether or not you're being sincere with yourself. It has nothing to do with me. There's an instant knowing. And when I was younger, I wasn't quite aware of that. I thought everybody was the same way. But I would see the lack of sincerity in the other person, and I would be turned off. And one of my biggest problems in my personal life has been that, I would initially tell the person, look, you're not being sincere. What you're telling me is not how you feel. It's not who you are. You're not really being sincere. And a few people would fight me on it, and insist on it. So I would embark on a demonstration that what they're saying is not true to them based on the inconsistencies between their behaviors, their words, their speech, and contradictions, whatever. No, totally inappropriate. I'm not proud of any of this. I'm just explaining where I'm coming from, in my past. So I would show them, look, you're not being sincere because look at this, look at this, look at this. And if the person insisted, no, this is my highest truth, I simply knew it wasn't, I would then have anger. I would have anger. And that was a huge stumbling block for me to overcome. It took me many, many years. And thank God, by working diligently on it, I was able to understand. And when I removed the anger, which I did years ago, the empathic quality increased significantly, to the degree where now, sometimes I'm not even with a person and they're thinking of something and I know what they're thinking and I know what's going on with that person. And let me tell you, sometimes it's a little bit of a burden because some people are suffering quite a bit. And you are continuously perceiving that, particularly if you tune into them. So all that I'm telling you is that we all have heaven right here on the earth, and it's inside of you. So some people are willing to go there. Some people have the guts. Some people have the courage to go there. I remember a man came here once, and this man dedicated his life not only to go there within himself. The most difficult thing you will do in your life is to go inside of you. Not only did this man lived for that, a friend of mine who is also a teacher in this system of ours, not only did he do that, but he helped thousands of people do the same. And he was telling me that one of his neighbors called him a coward for not getting enough results in life. And, it's a very interesting accusation. Oh, you're a coward for not getting enough results in life, because it begs the question, what results matter in this life? I'm not saying that money doesn't matter. And then, for the most part, I've been able to live and eat and have a roof and have some clothes on my back, But what about that do we take with us? And when we talk about results, if you have helped a few thousand people live a better life, does that count as results? So when a person says you're a coward for not having more results, of course, for an empath like my friend, it's like, whoa, this is serious. This is a massive blow. It comes across as a massive blow, and sometimes it's very difficult to deal with those kinds of blows. It's really fascinating about this interaction because I know both of these people. If you ask the person who called my friend a coward for not having better results in life, if you ask this person, did you insult so-and-so? They say, no, we're just talking. They don't get the magnitude of the insult because what this person did is she demeans and attacks the very core of what the other person is. But they don't recognize that as an attack. They recognize that as, it's my right to do that to you. You see? Because empaths, and this is one of the things that we talk a lot about in the classes and in some of these videos, empaths end up hooking up with people who have strong personality disorder. They're predators. They're predators. And see, because they're two sides of the same coin. Empaths oftentimes, until they learn how to deal with their empathy, they're oftentimes codependent people. They're dependent on others. They become disabled if they don't receive the understanding and the love from the people they choose in their lives. And what happens is, because of that dependency, they end up associating with people who take advantage of that. Those are predators. Those are vampires who basically suck the life right out of your bones. They do. They suck the life right out of them. And I've seen this over and over and over. And I remember as I was going through my own journey, it took years to recognize that, well, it is the very same quality that makes me who I am, and the very same quality that makes it possible for me to help so many people live better lives. It is the very same quality that is causing suffering in my personal life. When we understand that and we begin to make adjustments, we realize, okay, the quality itself, empathy itself, is not the problem. The problem is this codependency, which stems from actually not acknowledging who you are to yourself. Notice, it gets deep, right? You take the red pill, it goes deep. And I'm telling you this because those of you who are attracted to this channel and are listening to these talks are most likely empaths yourself. You're most likely just like this. You get this. You understand this. We have to stick together and we have to help one another come out of this suffering, because empathic people end up suffering more. They suffer deeper because they feel deeper. And there's a whole number of people in the world who feel nothing. You take the psychopath, for instance, and we all read about them. We see them in the movies. We see them, I remember when I was a kid in Brazil, this kid had not only killed both of his parents. This was like one of those horror crimes, but he actually went a step beyond. He killed both parents because the parents wouldn't give him some money or something else, But then he proceeded to split their bodies up into little pieces and put them in the freezer, something like that. And I remember when the police came, he was being interviewed, and they asked, well, how do you feel about this? Do you feel that maybe you did something wrong, perhaps, in killing both of them? And he says, no, not really. They probably needed to die already and so forth. Absolutely no feeling whatsoever. That is like the definition of psychopathy. So you have people in relationships, for instance, where they're able to not only break up today and move on tomorrow, they're actually able to move on before they break up their previous relationship. Think about that for a second. Think about that for a second, because in our society, we see this all the time, and we kind of assume that that's the case. People do that. What's wrong with this? I'm cheating, I'm doing this, I'm seeing two people at the same time, So I'm with this person, but I haven't really broken up and I'm with someone else. We take that to be normal. But think about what that means. Think about what that means to the person who does that. Don't worry about their victims. Think about the person. What must be going on within that person for them to be able to do this? I guarantee you that the person who does this cannot possibly be very connected to their soul, because it's impossible to live an experience with your heart and at the same, because there's privacy, there's secrets, there's a intimacy, there's a communication there. It is absolutely impossible, I guarantee you, to have a heart and have a relationship with your own heart and at the same time have an interaction at that level with one person and then turn around and do it with another person. It's impossible. The person who does this must be completely disconnected from themselves. Now, on the outside, the person can be very functional and get great results in life. You see? They can get great results because this world favors that. The physical world favors that. If you don't have any feelings, if there's no empathy, if you're not being dragged down by this boring thing called conscience, why not just take advantage of everybody else? Use everybody else for your own purposes. And when you say use everybody else for your own purposes, what are they looking for? Are they after your money? Are they after what? They're not. It doesn't really matter to them. They're after two things. Number one, they're after, it's like a drug to them. They're after the experience of forgetting their own deep, deep misery. So they use you to have an intense experience during which they forget their own misery. The experience is completely fake. Meanwhile, the empath invested his whole life into it. And number two, they're vampires. Because it's just like principles of economy. It's just like that. In economics, you cannot have everybody poor and yet create wealth. It doesn't work that way. Wealth is created by differences in poverty and wealth, so that the wealthier people can invest and create jobs for the poor people, so the poor people can advance and become wealthy themselves. So there has to be differences there, so that energy can flow, and from the flow of energy, something new is created. So a person who is absolutely poor, not just lack of money, but being poor internally, they cannot generate anything. They can only take from others. I'm not referring to poverty in terms of lack of money. I'm saying the person who is spiritually poor, they cannot generate, so they must take from others. So the so-called psychopath, by virtue of not having a soul, has no source of energy. They cannot exist without looking for victims to prey upon. And what they're literally vampires. They're sucking the life out of you. Now, you talk to anybody who has been involved with one of those vampires, and you ask them, okay, what happened to you? You talk to them and they say, well, I was in this relationship with this man, with this woman, and this happened, that happened, Okay, how did it end? The end is always tragic. The end is always tragic because the vampire, when they're done with you, they dispose of you like a piece of trash. There's absolutely no closure. There's absolutely no dialogue. They're vampires. They don't need you anymore. They discard you. But not only that, you ask the person, okay, how did you feel afterwards? The one who was with the vampire. They said, well, I felt lost, lifeless. This person took everything I had. And it's not about the money. It's not that they took your money, although sometimes that happens as well. They took the life out of your veins, and you say, okay, just like the description of what a vampire is. So what I'm telling you is that this whole business about the spiritual world and physical world is a bit more involved and serious than what meets the eye. What we need to do is begin to take stock of our lives a little bit more. We need to look back a little bit. We need to look back. When you go on a cruising ship, and some of you have been on a cruise ship, and you go to the back of the boat and you sit there for a while as the ship is sailing across the ocean, and you see the wake of the ship behind the ship, and you kind of imagine you're a fish or maybe a little animal floating on the surface of the water. This ship went through here and left a wake that sometimes goes for a mile or more behind the ship, disturbing the water, right? The propellers are pushing the boat forward, so the water has been disturbed, and you can see the wake. And if you're flying on an airplane, you can see this wake extending sometimes a couple of miles behind the ship. Our lives are like that. We leave a wake behind us. What I pray every night to my God, the God of glory, the God of peace, healing, love, I pray to a God of healing, a God of resolution, a God of love, a God of forgiveness. When I pray to God that the trail I live in my life is a trail of beauty, healing, love, affection. And of course I make mistakes. Let me think how often I make a mistake. I think about once every breath, maybe. In other words, all the time. Making mistakes all the time. And how do I know that? Because every time I look back, I go, dude, that could have been way better. You made a mistake there. That's called a conscience. You look back and you realize it could have been better. So there's a God of healing. And what I pray for is, allow me to make enough corrections in my life, enough changes, become enough of a person, because we're not people, we're animals. Allow me to become enough of a human being here to be able to leave a trail that at the very least isn't negative. I wish it could be positive. I wish I could leave some trail of beauty behind me, a trail of healing, a trail of, but even if I can't because of my human imperfection, I pray for a trail of at least neutrality. At least there are no dead bodies behind me. I don't mean that literally. I mean, people who left destroyed and suffering, So I pray that every interaction that we have, whether it's through this medium or in person, somehow adds to the quality of your life. Do you know why? Because if I'm able to add to the quality of your life, I'm adding to the quality of my life. Because you and I are not that separate, after all. That's how we started this whole thing. Separation, scarcity, forgetting, right? which altogether amounts to fear, is what the physical world is. So the extent to which we quit living out of fear, we quit living out of scarcity, forgetting, we remember who we are, the extent to which we cease to see, we cease to see one another as being separate and distant from us. We begin to see, wow, we're together in this. All people. We begin to see that unity there. To the same extent, we're living a more and more spiritual life. Now, I'm here to tell you one final thought. I know this is a long video. And that is this. If you are on this path, and if you are an empath, you're going to feel battered. You're going to feel absolutely battered by all kinds of injustices. I wish I could tell you different, but look at history. Look at the greatest avatars in this world. Look at the greatest messengers of the spiritual world throughout history, how they've been treated by humanity. Yeah, you're going to be battered. But rather than feeling bad about that, this is your opportunity to measure, to test exactly what we're talking about. If you love a person and they batter you and suddenly don't love them anymore, you didn't love them in the first place. It's okay. We got to grow up though. Not to bring this up from a religious point of view, but the Bible says that when people battered Jesus, tortured him, the only thing he said is, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. You see, there's absolutely no resentment there. There's only absolute love and desire for forgiveness. If you can reach that state, first of all, how would you know if you reach that state unless you've been battered by the people who matter the most to you? Like parents, spouses, children. You see, those are the people who are going to test you. Otherwise, it wouldn't matter. If it's the guy that lives across town and who you never know and he batters, it doesn't matter to you. It won't matter, so there's no test there. It's going to have to be the person who's closest to you. That's where the test is going to come from. Hey, remember the story of Abraham in the Bible? He finally had a son, and the Lord God asked him to sacrifice his son to test his faith. And it's kind of a symbolic way of saying to you that something similar happens to the empath on a spiritual path. You're going to be tested in the worst way possible. Of course, that's what advanced training is all about. The tests get more difficult. All you have to do, if you're on this path, is remain true to the love in your heart. Remain true to the fact that we're all together in this. Remain true to the fact that there's nothing to fear. Because the divinity that is in you is also in your aggressor. It's the same divinity that runs through all of our veins and arteries. It's the same life force. There's nothing to fear. There's nothing to lose. There's no separation. And if you experienced love at any level with anybody one day, true love, I'm not talking about like sexual attraction, which is awesome, by the way. I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying, I'm not talking about that kind of thing, infatuation, chemistry, sexual attraction. You know how you know if you love somebody, by the way? Let me tell you something. As long as this video is being extended, let's talk about that for a second. Here's how you know you love somebody. If you want to know, because sometimes it's not clear, you have this person in your life, let's say a spouse or a girlfriend, a boyfriend, and you say, yeah, I kind of like him, I don't know, and you don't know if you love this person or not. And I'll tell you exactly how you can know. Here's the question. How well do you know this person? See, knowledge of the person has everything to do with love. Remember when Adam and Eve were expelled from the Garden of Eden, and it says that Adam knew Eve? So to know is to love. See, Adam knew Eve, and then they had children. So to know is to love. So if you know somebody for real, not just superficially, not just their bodies, not just their habits or their... No. If you actually know somebody's soul, if you're an empath, that's easy. If you actually know somebody's souls, you're going to see that there's some difficult spots in there. You're going to see that there's some severe problems which the person tries to hide. You see, they're filled with fear in some cases, but they try to hide that by being aggressive, by pretending they don't care, they try to hide that. If you see all of that, and you also see that person, their soul is the most gorgeous, beautiful thing God ever created, but you also see both sides, you see. That's how you know you love the person. Let me make myself clear. It's easy to love somebody whom you find attractive. That's not what I'm talking about. As you begin to know the person's soul,